Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what I think is a really important webinar from IMAP. Today, we're fortunate enough to be joined by Adrian from Strategy 3, who's going to present on the submission that he's developed for the Quality of Advice Review. Adrian will talk about his submission and the background to it when I hand over to him, but Adrian's background is an extensive experience in working in advice firms. He brings a couple of decades of experience of managing and working within advice firms. Adrian will take a very broad view of the Quality of Advice Review and his submissions to it. And then I'll spend a little time talking about managed accounts in the context of considering quality in advice. So I'll be focusing just on one aspect of it. But before I hand over to Adrian, though, what I'd like to do is tell you a little about IMAP's upcoming events, in particular our Advice in Action conference in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane in the next week or so. Here's the agenda. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you'll see that we've really tried to focus on those issues that affect both the profitability and efficiency of advice practices, and those things which enable an advice business to speak to their clients' needs. For example, about climate change, and speak to the challenges facing advice businesses. For example, the competition for talent. It really is, well, it's a packed agenda, as you'll see through the day, but it's really real life examples from real life practitioners. You'll all know how to ask a question, I'm sure, but just to remind you, if you'd like to ask a question, just use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We have left plenty of time for questions at the end, and I'm sure there will be a number. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to Adrian to talk about the Quality of Advice Review and his submission to it. Adrian, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Toby. And thank you everyone for joining me on this very cold winter's day. It's a very, very sharp sort of winter's drop in temperature at the moment outside. But I hope all of you are very well. Now, in relation to the content for today, we're going to talk about the Quality of Advice Review, spend a little bit of time on its objectives, terms, and timeline. But we're really going to delve into some of the key issues of the review. And we're really going to ask the question, what can we do to actually help reduce the cost of advice so that more Australians can access high quality advice? And I'll touch on some of the recommendations that my submission is making. And then Toby, as he mentioned, will actually talk a little bit about some of the solutions that he's also making and the recommendations he's making in his submission. So there's a few things in here that one naturally asks in relation to this review. Why is the Quality Advice Review so important to us as a financial advice profession? I honestly think that this review is our chance to be heard, with Treasury really seeking to understand what has 20 years of over-regulation done to the financial advice profession and to access to advice for consumers. It's a very important question because what their Treasury is actually saying, we understand that we need to streamline because the costs have risen in advice through the roof. We also understand and we hear that rules have overtaken the outcome of the advice. We need to be more principles-based to allow financial advisors the ability to exercise professional judgment. There's a round recognition across the profession that documentation doesn't equate to understanding. And that documentation piece and the disclosure piece has failed. And therefore they're saying, what can you do to help? What can we do to help actually facilitate proper understanding and a reduced burden in documentation? And they've recognized that there are unintended consequences of all this regulatory reform. And so the review is 24 hours away from submission. And I've been madly working on my submission. I know Toby is working on his, but we've actually addressed a whole range of things from the 11th of March when they released their terms of reference through to effectively 24th of March when they gave us a list of questions. And once these submissions are in, Treasury will take some time to actually review them. Realistically, it might take them a few months before they effectively publish the submissions that everyone has put in. And then there's a final report due to Treasury in December. The key point to note is this review was commissioned under a previous government and under a previous Corporations and Finance Minister. Now we're actually in a situation whereby this review will still continue, but the recommendations will be handed to the new government. And we hope, cautiously optimistic, but we hope that the new government will also take these recommendations very seriously because it really impacts a lot of society in Australia in a very important way. So what do I hope to achieve in the submission? As Toby mentioned, I've had over 20 years of experience really working with financial advice. I'm a very passionate advocate for financial advice. I honestly believe it is a massive positive benefit to consumers. It really helps them. If I were to look at it, it really helps them improve their financial well-being over the course of a lifetime. And because of that, I've been very lucky to work with some amazing advisors, most recently in Shadforth, but even before then, with a whole bunch of advisors throughout all industry who really represent the heartland of small business Australia. And what they do for their client base is a very admirable and a noble profession. And you'll hear me wax lyrical about advice because I honestly think this is a great profession, but it's been maligned by quite a lot of bad press, and certainly quite a lot of misunderstanding of what advice does. So we're hoping to make sure Treasury understands what actually is the on-the-ground impact of their recommendations and what will actually shift the dial backwards. What will actually shift this so that people can access advice in a meaningful way. So the review is very broad. They've actually asked 83 questions across 12 different topics. As you said, I could basically spend literally 200 to 300 pages trying to write an answer to this. But ultimately, there are a couple of key themes that we're going to touch on today. And these ones are the important ones for advisors and also for managed accounts as well. But there are key ones here around how do you define quality? What drives up the cost of advice? A recognition from the government that they need to increase access to advice. But how might they facilitate that? They'll talk a little bit about intra-fund and limited advice and digital advice. There's quite a lot of discussions around that. We won't touch on it today because there's quite a lot in there, but in effect, we will touch on some of the things that we might do to increase access. A big one is the removal of the safe harbor provisions, which we'll touch on. Big one for the advisors is a removal of further exemptions from conflicted remuneration. And realistically, what they're talking about there is life insurance commissions. There's a lot of work in fee consents, and so we will touch on that briefly. And finally, advice documentation. So as I mentioned to you before, 20 years of regulatory reform, it is probably one of the most over-regulated industries we've ever seen, and we get hit with everything. And the big elements of this reform, the big ones, every single one of these things has driven structural change in the players and the number of advisors. So if we go all the way back to 20 years ago and FSR, that drove very big changes in the industry around the remuneration models, the product subsidies and the volume-based subsidies, and even a lot of just the normal subsidies that existed that subsidized the cost of advice were shifted and eliminated. And therefore, those conflicted remuneration, so my apologies, FSR was the creation of the licensing regime, which started us down this process, but FOFA was where the structure, the remuneration provisions and the banning on conflicted remuneration caused major structural change. It also caused a transformation in the industry for advisor firms to start saying, well, we do provide value to our client base, and therefore we should focus on what our service proposition is. So as everyone started transforming the different business models, we then got the life insurance reforms coming in. And when the life insurance reforms came in, we saw further reduction and shifting in the revenue sources that an advisor could actually use to offset the cost of advice. And effectively, then the costs were then transparently transferred across into the cost of advice for a retail client. But it didn't stop there. We had the Royal Commission, we had the raising of professional standards, and now it just continues on and on and on. So as a result of all of these different layers of regulation, we don't just look at the law that drives these changes. We look at the ASIC interpretations of the law, which then add this extra layer. They fill in the blanks. The law might write something simple, and then ASIC gives you a regulatory guide, whereby then you are now given a whole stack of extra rules, prescriptions, and interpretations. And when we look at that, if we are a licensee in the market, you might look at that and you go, well, I still need to make that more translatable before I implement it. So we layer on regulation. And by layering on regulation, we layer on costs. So what has actually resulted as a result of this in the market from all this layers of regulation? Well, these are some of the current statistics today that I wanted to sort of really point out to everybody today, which is we believe there's something in the order of around about 5.6 million individuals which are likely to be seeking advice today. In the market, there are 16,783 advisors on the register as around about 26th of May. This is down from 28,000 in 2018. So if you think about that, in just a short period of 3.5 years, maybe 4 years, you've had such a drastic reduction. And we believe that if you look at the sort of advisor ratings reports, you can see that that number is drastically reducing further, as a whole range of advisors are still yet to complete the competency exam. And not only the exam, a whole bunch of them are saying, look, you know what, I've worked in this industry for 20 years. They've not recognized my prior learning and experience. And what benefit is there for me to go back to university to get a tertiary degree when I'm already a qualified and experienced advisor? So there's a lot of work around the reduction of advisor numbers that has to be done. On average at the moment, as those advice businesses have transformed their offerings, they've been disengaging clients who can't afford to actually access the ongoing service fee or the minimum fee that the advisor will charge. So the advisor is now focusing on less and less more profitable clients and developing deeper and deeper relationships with them. But we're seeing hundreds of thousands of clients being disengaged. And those clients now, formerly advised clients, orphans, if you will, are now finding it very difficult to access advice. The average cost of advice has actually increased and has actually gone up, basically around about 8% from the past year. This is a number, again, quoted by Advisor Voice and the advisor ratings reports. And we also note that 234 AFSLs ceased their business. And you can see this when you see large players in the industry have been exiting since effectively the Royal Commission. And you can also see a lot of the smaller licensees are actually saying, we can't afford to run the cost of this license because the compliance burden is out of hand. And so the compliance burden is driving a whole stack of businesses closing supply of advice. And what we've seen is a reduction in capacity. And that's a really key point, a reduction in capacity to serve per advisor. So effectively, if an advisor can now only really service 100 or less than 100 clients in a given year, then effectively the millions of individuals seeking advice will never really be, we won't even make a dent with the number of advisors that we have and the actual technology and the regulation that we have today. So what does this mean? The human cost of over-regulation. And I wanted to touch on this because I've worked with a lot of amazing advisors. And what we see at the moment, our study is showing that 73% of advisors are reporting high levels of stress and burnout from work. And when you look at these numbers, they're alarming. There was 17% experiencing depression almost most of the time or all of the time. 42% are considering leaving the profession, not because they can't meet the competency or the compliance pieces. They're saying it's too much. And there's 80% of them, 82% of them are citing that there's stress from daily compliance demands. So one of the key things here is we noted, it's been reported in the press in 2019, there was a number of financial advisors who committed suicide, unfortunately, at a rate that was 3.2 times higher than the national average. And as a result of that, I think, I would say to all of you, and I know there's some advisors on the call, if any of this is triggering you and causing you to feel that stress and that pain, which I know you're going through, again, please, for all of us, please speak to somebody. There is a lot of help available, and you're not going through this alone. So if you look at this profession and you look at the human cost of this impact, the impetus for doing something is extremely high. So what are we really sort of talking about doing in relation to this? So we're saying, just bear with me, Toby, I've managed to lose control of the remote, but if I could ask you to forward the next slide, thank you. So in terms of this, what's happening is, the key thing that's happening is there is a massive barrier coming in terms of supply to advice. If more Australians want it, but there's real challenges in supplying it, what happens is there's more disadvantage in society. But who is being disadvantaged if they don't have access to advice? The reality is it's the people who are younger, who don't have enough critical mass in investments. It's the people who are older, who also don't have, or who have declining amount of investments. The people who don't have enough just before and after retirement. And so with costs being prohibitive, we're actually finding that the divide between the haves and have-nots rises. And that's one of the key points we're trying to make to Treasury and to submission is less access to advice is not good for the Australian society at all. The other thing in here is economics are unsustainable. There's a whole stack of things going on in the market on the supply side that would cause the ability for us to continue to service these markets to be unsustainable. And therefore, every advisor is moving up the value chain and choosing to service smaller, more profitable clients, which is wonderful in a lot of ways for those clients. And those advisors are able to pivot their business model to go there. But it leaves us with this issue of what happens with the rest who can't access advice. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So what we have here is the safe harbor steps. And one of the key hot topics here, and it was a fallout from the Royal Commission, is should we remove the safe harbor? Because it's a view going on in industry that safe harbor is the reason why the compliance overload is happening at the moment. There's a view that safe harbor was the reason why the advice steps are so prescriptive, why ASIC is, making sure there's so much documentation evidence, so it's process over outcome. And I've got a different view. If you think about a circus at the moment and you think about a trapeze artist, the safe harbor is actually a safety net that sits underneath that trapeze artist. And what it's meant to do is actually say, the way the law is written is, you have a duty as an advisor to act in your client's best interest. It's an outcome or an outcomes-based test. So we all said to Treasury at the time, well, if you tell us that, we're going to get sued within an inch of our life. So tell us, give us some level of a safety net, a floor that actually tells us, if I do these steps, I'll deem to have met that larger best interest duty. And therefore, all I need to do is just prove that I've done these steps. So they created a safe harbor. So the question that the review is asking is, if you remove the safe harbor, what replaces it? Like, is it better if we remove it? Is it better that the trapeze artist basically flies without a net? And the key questions then is, there's a code of ethics. There's a whole bunch of things in the code of ethics that actually almost like put in an extra layer on top. And there are some problems with the safe harbor today, because if you look at each of those steps down the bottom, step G basically is what we call the catch-all provision. And it actually says you can do all the 6 steps that's from A to F, but just in case, if we can still choose to say that you should have done an extra step. There should have been an extra step to discharge the best interest duty. So there are some problems with the current bid as it is. My recommendation at the moment to them is not to dump it, but to effectively maintain it, but to just make it more aligned to what an advisor does. So if you look at it at the moment, we're looking at recommendations. So I'll touch on those ones. We make some recommendations, and you'll have a copy of these slides so you can go through them in more detail, but there will be the submission once it's ready, which I'll be happy to share with members, around how to measure quality, because quality is not measured in the way of documentation. And so Toby will touch on this, but we think quality should be measured in whether or not, with reference to whether or not the advice is likely or more likely to help the client achieve their goal or solve their problem. And that is something that should happen over time. We also have a whole range of recommendations in relation to increasing access to advice. But one of the key things that we're really talking about here is making sure that advice effectively is more advice is enabled through general advice. That, we can actually talk to clients about a whole range of things without going as far as actually making a recommendation on a specific product and telling them this is suitable for you. We should be able to do a lot of that, but the law doesn't quite work that way. And also in terms of access to advice, a very important part is reducing the cost. And one of the key things of the cost is, how do we make sure that it's not just the SOA, the cost that's coming down, but the ongoing cost of servicing a client, which is effectively a lot more than just advice documentation. And how do we free them up? We talked about safe harbor. The next item we talked about briefly was conflicted rem. And all I'll tell you around conflicted rem is this: there is a movement to remove life insurance commissions from the remaining exemptions. But what we see today is that literally it has driven the wrong structural impact in the industry, whereby now most people are choosing not to do insurance advice. So the numbers over a 7-year period have come down by 50% in relation to new business going into life insurance products. And again, this is an issue because, at the end of the day, if it's never really the person who effectively gets hit by the life insurance event who actually bears the cost, it's the community and the family around them. And so there are some real issues around, if you take commissions away and you reduce it to zero, then what's left? Because in effect, some people will be able to afford it in the advice fees, which, in Shadforth, we were quite happy to, we've got high net worth clients, we're happy to service those clients, and insurance can always be packaged in as part of the advice fees. But what about normal retail Australia, where they still have some difficulties around affording that advice? Well, that again disadvantages the people and the areas in the segments in the population who don't have as much wealth and who need insurance more. We talk about fee consents, and then finally, I think we'll touch on the fact that advice documentation actually needs to change to something simpler, because currently it's not working. So there are a lot of industry submissions going in that talk about, instead of creating a whole new document, or we basically say kill off the SOA and the ROA and just have what effectively for me is a principles-based file note of the advice. And that advice record, I'm calling it, some people are calling it a letter of advice, some people are calling it something else, that should be much shorter than what it is. It should be less about, it shouldn't be the primary vehicle that we use to educate clients on advice. It should be the documentation piece that says, these are the key points of our advice. We can give it to the client if we need to, but at the end of the day, we should free the advisor up to educate the client in the meeting and to actually hit the key points without making them read through a 70-page nightmare. So I'll touch on this again in relation to why advice is so expensive. This document effectively, just this spider web of a diagram, it's probably too small for you to read through, but really it'll be in the papers that we send out. This just gives you an idea of how many systems and how many times, how many pieces of paper do we shuffle to move somebody from the beginning of an advice process all the way through to implementation. It's a major project. It's not something that you just go, oh, it's a 5-page document, we're done. This is literally a 4 to 10 week process that effectively needs people watching and multiple parties involved. It's a mixture of systems and paper. It is expensive to provide initial advice. But it's not the only thing that actually drives up the cost of advice. If you look at what an advisor really does, if there's a national average of about 100 ongoing service clients per advisor, then really, they're not really going to put in, they're full. They're not going to put in a lot of new clients. Maximum in a given year, they're going to put in maybe 7 to 10 clients. And that's a pretty big growth period where they're going to take on a new client for initial advice. So what are they spending their time in the week on? Well, from what we can tell, and from my time in Chadforth and quite a few other businesses, they're spending their time on all this stuff below, which is they're spending time preparing for annual reviews. They're spending a heck of a lot of time on researching and keeping on top of change, client emails, a lot of implementation work, a lot of manual technical reading and just change management. And that administration, literally, you multiply by 100 what they're doing for 100 clients. That is where most of their week is. So we need solutions that can actually drive down the cost of ongoing service. So at this point, I'll hand over to Toby, who's going to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that are happening on that side.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And let me just now move on, because this is the perfect segue into talking about managed accounts in the context of the quality of advice review and our approach to the quality of advice. We're going to be speaking to effectively the last question in the paper, the catch-all question. We're going to be speaking to further actions that ASIC licensees, professional associations could take to improve quality, accessibility, affordability of advice. And I want to start off by talking about the dimensions of quality. My main concern with the whole quality of advice review, and in fact, so much of the discussion that takes place around advice and quality, is that it views advice as a transactional process. It views advice as something which, as Adrian's just mentioned, takes 4 to 10 weeks to arrive at a document, end of process. But it isn't the end of the process. If we think about the dimensions of quality, first and foremost, quality advice isn't about advice in and of itself. Advice is irrelevant. The quality of advice process is about doing those things which increase the probability that the client will achieve their personal goals within their personal constraints. So the first dimension of quality is increasing the probability of success for the client. Another dimension of quality is being able to accommodate multiple goals or not necessarily consistent constraints. For example, ESG objectives, which may be in conflict with return objectives or with existing holdings objectives. Another dimension of quality, of course, is cost and value. Another is consistency with the risk appetite of the client. That's tied back, of course, to the probability of success, but should be thought of separately. And the final one I want to pick up on is the issue of timeliness. So I'm sorry that there are a lot of words on the screen, but the purpose of personal advice relating to investments, managed accounts are about the investment part of advice, is meeting client goals through investment over time, and cost is incurred over time. And so what are those things that you can say increase quality because they raise the probability of success, for example? Close alignment with client circumstances, a structured process, timeliness. And I want to draw attention to a piece of research which Philo Capital Advisors, an organisation with which I have an association, did a few months ago on the cost of delay. And I'll talk about that aspect, that dimension of quality in just a moment. But then the other dimension which raises the probability of success, i.e. raises the quality, is a systematic implementation, a systematic set of processes for making investment decisions and putting them into effect, which result in more frequent review of portfolio composition to adjust to market circumstances, new products that might be more suitable for a client than the products they have, reviewing products that are in their portfolio, or reviewing individual securities or ETFs that are in their portfolio, which might be replaced, increased in exposure or reduced in exposure. Asset allocation decisions, which mean that the probability of success is raised. It's having processes which are less likely to result in erratic outcomes or variation between clients. As Adrian said, an advisor has 100 clients, and frequently there's a bell curve of exposure to risk, 60% of them in the balanced category. If you look at the returns and volatility of portfolios for clients who are ostensibly the same, a number of factors increase randomness of outcomes. Again, I want to refer to an as yet unreleased piece of research from Philo on unfair rebalancing, but particularly I want to reference something which I was only made aware of just a few days ago by Rowan Stewart of Equitas, which speaks exactly to this point. Using live data over a long period of time, they've looked at cohorts of clients of similar risk characteristics and the range of returns that those clients have experienced. That's not quality. Anybody who's put themselves through the Deming studies knows that control of process is essential to quality. Systematic processes are likely to lead to lower costs, both from the ability to manage costs, ask any fund manager about rebates, and to a reduction in process cost. And it allows advisors to spend more time on processes which clients say they find valuable. So let's pick up on a couple of these dimensions and a couple of ways of addressing costs. So on the screen is a diagram very similar to Adrian's spiderweb diagram of the documents produced, or the documents required to produce a piece of advice. So this diagram is taken from the KPMG study done for the FSC, and it tries to identify those steps in the process which end up in a statement of advice. So let me just highlight because it's probably a little difficult to see. Licensees at the bottom, paraplanners on the next row up, advisors, and finally clients. So this is KPMG's diagram of process to arrive at a review. An implementation of advice is sort of this final box here. So let's now think about this diagram. I mean, my problem is, as I mentioned right at the start, with the approach of the quality of advice review and of so much thinking about advice, that it takes a partial and episodic view of a relationship between a client and their advisor that might persist for 10 or 20 years. 10 or 20 years sounds like a long time, but of course, if you think about your own advice practice, a 5% attrition rate implies a 20-year relationship. And that's common in my experience, that many advisors expect their relationships to last at least 10 years. So let's think about the implications of 20-year relationships between clients. So let's take that KPMG FSC diagram and say, well, actually, that's not the key. That's not a proper way of thinking about the advice relationship over time, of thinking about those elements which actually are the dimensions of a quality relationship. It's what happens here. It's what happens over the 20-year process from the time the initial statement of advice is created for another 20 years. For sort of simplification purposes, I've just drawn this as being effectively a quarterly review process. But of course, most managed accounts aren't that. Most managed accounts are ad hoc structure or respond to ad hoc events, are able to respond to ad hoc events in a way that individual advisors simply cannot do. We had Paul Forbes from RFS in Ravenna moderate a webinar session last week on transforming advice into wealth management. One of the points I remember from that was Paul saying in the Friday session, I think, that the thing which made him focus on the need for managed accounts in their practice was a decision across their client base of about 300 clients to remove a manager who was held in 60 to 70% of portfolios. So that's 180 to 200 or so portfolios. So they'd made a decision that they were going to remove a particular manager. He said it took them a year. And we'll see in just a moment the implications of that statement, that we made a decision, turned out to be the right decision. It took us a year. This cannot be a measure of a quality process. So the costs of creating and implementing advice over time far outweigh the upfront costs of creating a single statement of advice. If we're thinking about quality, and IMAP submission will try and make this point in as clear a way as we can. If we're thinking about dimensions of quality of advice, we're going to be thinking about those things that pertain to the delivery of an advice relationship over time. Those things that lead to higher probability of the client achieving their personal goals. Now, so I want to go back and touch on, the implications of timeliness, one of the dimensions of quality that I spoke about. And so here's a graph from the Philo study on the cost of delay. So the assumptions in this are that you make a set of decisions over time, over a year, and by and large, those decisions are right, by and large. Not always, but by and large. So what does market data tell us about the implications of being right, but not being able to implement? What this study shows us is that if you make decisions as an advisor that are by and large right, and this study was at the asset allocation level only, it didn't take into account making decisions about active management or active managers. It's just it effectively is a rebalance periodically to an asset allocation, and by and large make the correct calls. 20 years of data tells us that simple process, not simple to do, but that process will deliver at least a 1.1% alpha, if you like, compared to not taking access. But what happens if those decisions are delayed by a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks? If they're delayed by a month, so if you make a decision, but it takes a month for that decision to be implemented, 50% of the value which as an advisor your process has created is dissipated, lost. If that takes 3 months, if you work on a quarterly review cycle, for the client who was reviewed last week, we make a decision this week, I'll see them again in a quarter. 80% of the value of the decision is lost. This is market data speaking. This is just one dimension of quality, but it's one which we can measure. Is timeliness a contributor to quality? And the answer is it absolutely is. Now let's talk about some other dimensions of quality. And here I'm going to refer to some work done by Investment Trends on the experience of advisors in the use of managed accounts and the way in which, and I've, if you like, interpreted their responses by thinking about it from a quality perspective. So I've listed a number of dimensions here. Cost to client, more time for other tasks with that client, or more time for other clients, and more professional management. And I'll touch on that in the next slide. So advisors who use managed accounts say, yes, actually, we do deliver lower cost to clients. This process, this better process, does actually give us more time for other tasks or other clients. And it does give us effective ways to access professional funds management in a way that an individual advisor trying to do those things that Adrian showed us on his last slide of acting as portfolio manager simply is incapable of delivering on. So let's touch on that dimension of portfolio management, systematic portfolio management. How does that intersect with a need for quality? Well, in the experience of advisors, the lived experience of advisors who adopt this approach, outsourcing investment management either away from the advisor, this means, but either internally to a licensee investment committee or to a combination of an advised investment committee, or completely outsourced to a Morningstar or a Lonsec or a Zenith or a consultant like Jana or Russell's. It enables me as an advisor to focus more time on meeting client goals. I can access institutional grade investment management. I can deliver portfolios at a lower cost. So in summary, for us, quality is delivered over time. It isn't a transactional experience. There's no point in the relationship which is more important than the creation of that statement of advice, the capture of the client's goals, the surfacing, if you like, of goals and constraints. But in a 20-year relationship, there are, well, actually 1,040 opportunities on a weekly basis to add value. And it's the accretion of value over that 20-year period which demonstrates whether quality has been delivered or not. So Adrian, thanks very much, and back to you. Now, just to recap, of course, we'd encourage questions, and there are a number that have come through. So if there are questions that you have about Adrian's submission or about the review generally, please send them through.
Now, Toby, I'm actually like, maybe if we can go to the quality advice slide at the very back of the pack, which I think is just here. I thought there's some questions coming through. Oops, some questions that have come through to, quality, and I thought it would be really worthwhile for me to talk a little bit more about why quality matters, because today the balance of compliance assessment has swung into documentation, not quality. And so there's a very big difference between documentation of advice and the quality. But this is a model I put together in my submission, which is really talking about, quality should always be assessed in light of what the client's trying to achieve. And hence the client is at the center of this framework to assess quality. we should always be asking ourselves, whatever the advice was, forget about how many disclaimers, how many sort of like, pieces of file notes that we had that backed it up. At the end of the day, if the client takes up the advice, would it be more likely to solve or move them towards the goal they're trying to achieve? Now, this could be transactional, could be a simple and easy problem they have to solve today, or it could be a very complex intergenerational wealth transfer problem, or it could be a whole range of things that there's and this equally applies to strategy that wraps around what a client's trying to achieve, or a simple transaction such as, I need to withdraw $20,000 to pay a deposit on a car. Right. So when we look at this, is the advice more likely to solve the problem of the goal? Does the advice, in a lot of ways, if I look at it, educate and empower the client to make an informed decision? Now, for some clients, education is not as important as just get it done for me. So these factors are scalable. It really means that the emphasis of whether or not one of this is more important than the other, it should all depend on the eye of the client who's actually sort of looking at it, from their perspective. We know that representing value to the client is a function of both whether or not the things that we did for the client actually are things that they value and they're willing to pay for. For some clients, they don't value a lot of the bells and whistles, and for some clients, they absolutely do. There's a controversial one here, but I've got an analogy here relating to quality, which is actually around, if advice is of value in its own right, financial advice, for us to really make it work, we've got to improve our client situation over time. We've talked about this a lot. We're trying to increase their total well-being, not just their financial, their family well-being. There's a lot of things that an advisor does outside of the realm of the SOA. And what we are trying to say here is, the advice should actually be put into action, because having a piece of advice itself, it's similar to this. It's like I can read every single thing about healthy eating, but if I don't actually do anything about it, my health is worse off. So yes, I've got a utility value in knowing how to be healthy, but if I don't do anything about it, what's the point? And so I think that advice to be assessed from a quality perspective, from a provider's perspective, we want that advice to be put into action. It shouldn't just sit on the shelf. The advice should manage the risk appropriately. And whatever that risk is, be it the risk of, the risk that a technical strategy could give to a client, all the way through to simple things like helping your client manage their own family risks and their own risk properly. And finally, the advice should be technically sound and feasible. And that's more from a provider's perspective. So when you add all of these things together, you'll find that none of this is about, well, maybe a little bit can be fulfilled in documentation, but it's actually more about what did the client want to achieve and how did the advice get them there? And that's one of the key points, that if I could make the best interest GE align more to this, to be more about these factors, if I can make compliance audits look more like this and be less focused on the documentation aspects of it and more focused on, maybe just proving that these are the rationales for the advice, we might have a chance to actually sort of focus on quality and less on process in those documentation pieces. Yeah. Now, if
thanks. Thanks. We've got a couple of questions coming through, Adrian. Let's tackle those. So do you want to talk a little about your approach to, I know that you mentioned the fee disclosure statement, doing away with the fee disclosure statement, and there's a question there that relates to how you see this sort of aggregate fee disclosure, fee consent process working.
Yeah, so look, I think one of the key things there at the moment, there's a lot of extra admin and burden just created by having 5 nannies supervising fee consents. Right? That's the way I put it. An advisor sees the entirety of a client. So let's say, for example, like I've got my own personal advisor. My advisor basically has agreed a start date and end date to my fixed term agreement. Like we've got a 12-month fixed term agreement, and he's worked out, okay, this is how much it'll cost to do the advice, and this is the value that I represent. So I've given him consent to charge that amount, that amount on my investments over the next year. The issue here is I'm going to then, as a client, get individual fee consents from one from Macquarie, one from another super fund, one from the other. The dates are not going to align. So I might have signed up on the 31st of January with my advisor. I'm getting weird forms coming in different dates. I'm getting platform limitations. I'm getting all these other people telling me that, oh, our systems can't handle that 31st of January date. So the date will be different and the dollars will be different. So just for argument's sake, let's say if I put $12,500 in advice fees to my advisor, I've got 2,000 coming from one party, 3,000 from another. It confuses the heck out of me. And I spoke to my advisor yesterday, and he told me that he's just spending all this time synchronizing, having all the review dates line up, having all of the appointment dates go. He's spending time, cost, and energy on doing that, not for the clients. It's really like he's got to, it's almost like a logistical exercise to synchronize it. So to answer that question, what it comes down to is there's so much admin being driven by all of these people not syncing up. I mean, I don't like the idea of having 5 nannies because I see that the advisor is primarily responsible for getting that consent from the client. But because they've imposed these extra supervisors on top of us around this piece, the least they can do is make the forms consistent, make it easy for the advisor, make the data available for the advisor, and make it easy so the advisor doesn't have to manually reconcile everything. It just adds to the cost. So that's one.
To my mind, it actually, to my mind, it speaks to the inclination of the regulator, of ASIC in particular, to have one licensee supervise another licensee. If you're a licensee and you've got a legal and compliant consent to a thing, fees in this particular case, it should be enough for another licensee, an IDPS operator or a trustee, to go, yep, yes, you are authorized to do this. MDA providers have exactly this problem in spades. It's this, oh, well, set somebody else to watch the advisors, and that seems to me that
that's it. Well, the law makes it all the advisor's responsibility, and then the code of conduct that sits on top of that, which is also in the law, makes it all the advisor's responsibility. So why do we need another 3 more nannies?
Yes. Okay. Now there's a question here about do you want to expand a little on what you called, I think, an advice record, as opposed to the combination of statement of advice record?
Thank you. So a lot of energy and time is wasted on, I've got, I'm sorry to use my own advisor. I think we spent a lot of my meeting talking about why he needs to do an SOA as opposed to an ROA, right? And there's a lot of energy wasted, right? And there's a massive cost differential too in relation to that, because it takes him quite a long time to have to do the SOA. And when we started talking about it, the key point around it was that an advice document, what is the purpose of an advice document? It really should be there to document the advice that you gave the client. It serves partially as a risk management tool, but it really isn't an education tool if you really look at it. Right? So I take some inspiration from the record of advice around this, because in that situation, an advisor can give advice verbally to a client. So, most advisors I speak to, every time they give advice to a client, even if they have to hand over a massive document, they summarize it all in an email. So they've already done a short form that is something that sits on top of the legal document, because the legal document has failed. So they're basically saying to me, so what I'm suggesting is that kill off the SOA and ROA, and what should be in an advice record? Probably a few things. One of them is principles. The first principles-based piece is it should be as big or as small as the size and nature of the interaction with your client. So if the client just said to me, I just want to get this one small thing sorted, it should be a very short form document. It shouldn't be a one size fits all. That's probably the first part about and if you look at what's in an advice document today, it's mostly warnings and disclaimers. So realistically, none of it generates trust with a client, because the client wants to understand what the advice is to solve their problem. So we go back into what is the problem the client's trying to solve, or the goal the client's moving towards. How does the advice a section that says, how does the advice effectively get you there? And it can be as short as the advisor needs, because there's a lot of research and file notes that sit behind that document. And then when you look at it, I think it would be prudent as a professional to, if there are material risks, not every risk, but if there are material risks that a client needs to know with the strategy that you're recommending, or inherently the nature of the service that you're recommending, you should at least hit the high points. And everything else, read it in the PDS, right? It's just those high points, the major points. Now, disclosures is a big part of an SOA or an ROA. Disclosures are 10 pages of tables, right? Because we disclose at the platform level, we disclose at the investment option level, we disclose my brother's cousin's connection to somebody along the value chain. None of it actually, in a lot of ways, when I ask clients and I ask my advisors, in the past, none of it matters to the client, because the client just really wants to know a couple of things. They want to know how much the advice costs in total, right? How much does the advice cost? What is the cost of the solutions you're recommending for me? They don't need every breakdown line. Some people do, but they don't really need that level of detail. But what they do want to know is this: if you're giving me this advice, there's a conflicts disclosure, but they're more interested in, is there anything financial, realistically, that you as an advisor would directly get as a result of this recommendation? Remember, the law that was written in this place was 20 years old. Like, it actually was written at a time before FSR, when everybody was interrelated, vertical integration, structures everywhere. After FOFA, the remuneration arrangements are almost all of them are gone. So really, it's not about disclosure. Like, it should only be, look, I'm your advisor. I don't stand to gain anything, maybe insurance commission as a result of this piece of advice. And if my licensee somewhere 3 times removed happens to have a relationship with BT or with any of the others, none of that is not capable of impacting my advice, because I don't get a single cent. I have no incentive to recommend that. So it doesn't belong in the advice document as a disclosure. I think you could save 10 pages of tables and unnecessary disclosure just by getting disclosures really focused on what actually does the advisor financially benefit to gain.
There have been a couple of questions about the slides. We will be making those available. The recording for this webinar will be up on the IMAP YouTube channel, which you can access through the IMAP website, imap.asn.au. There's a link there in our videos page to this that should be there later today or early tomorrow. And of course, the CPD certificates will be sent out within a day or so for this session. So let me just then wrap up for today by just reminding you that we will have, as I say, advice in action, where we'll be touching not so much on this particular topic of the quality of advice review, but we will be looking at the underpinning issues of dimensions of quality. We will be looking at those things which enable individual advisors, advice practices, and licensees to deliver more predictable outcomes to clients. So Adrian, on behalf of the literally hundreds of people who've participated in this session today, thank you very much for your presentation today, but more importantly, thank you for taking the trouble as a private citizen to remain engaged with what is a really important issue. In concluding, I'm reminded that when FOFA was first released in about 2011 or so, going to a breakfast at which Peter Kells, who was then the Deputy Commissioner of ASIC, I think, was speaking about FOFA. And I have this very clear recollection of Peter Kells saying, well, the good thing about FOFA is that it will enable more advice to be delivered to more people for less money. So I hope he wasn't paid on a success fee basis. So Adrian, thanks very much for your time. Thank you everybody who joined, and we'll look forward to seeing you in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone.